Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at the Lahti L-35 pistols. It's a Finnish domestic semi-automatic 9mm service pistol, presumably developed to replace the Luger in Finnish service, although that never actually, strictly speaking, happened. The gun was designed by Aimo Lahti, who was one of Finland's predominant firearms designers, also known for the Lahti Celeranti machine guns and the L-39 anti-tank gun, among others. And he originally came up with this idea in 1929. At that time, he was still busy overseeing production of the LS-26 machine guns, so he actually had the weapons depot in Helsinki manufacture the first prototype, which became known as the L-29 pistol. That was tested by the Army and found to be not so great. They had a couple of complaints. They complained that the gun was too heavy, that the trigger was too stiff, and that it occasionally happened to fire in full auto when you didn't want it to, which is definitely a problem. Lahti, as he had time, went through the pistol, changed the design a bit. He fixed the full auto problem, and he also improved the trigger and sent the gun back for consideration, and it was actually adopted at that point as the L-35 pistol in 1935. Now, just because they had adopted the gun doesn't mean they actually had any of them on hand. At that point, in January of 1936, an order was formally placed with VKT, the state rifle factory, for 2,500 of these pistols. VKT ended up having to do some modification to the design. For example, the guns were originally set up with wooden grips. They discovered that in humid conditions or in the snow or when they got wet, the grips could swell, and when that happened, they would interfere with the trigger mechanism and then cause malfunctions. So they came up with a plastic grip instead, which was replaced on the guns before any production actually happened. By 37 or 38, they still hadn't delivered any guns except for the very first pre-production prototypes. So the order was canceled. A new order for like 7,500 was placed. Ultimately, by the summer of 1939, they still hadn't delivered any except for pre-production trials guns. Production would finally start to get underway in late 39. And we then have five separate series, really, variations on the Lahti pistol that would be produced. So let's take a closer look, and we'll go through each of those series, series 0 through series 4, and show you the differences and how the design evolved over time. So the first, or what's actually identified as the 0 series of Lahti pistols, is about 100 guns running from serial number 1006 through serial number 1104, and these were used for initial field trials before more substantial production got underway. This is, as you can see from the serial number, technically not one of those. This is a 3-digit gun, serial number 32, and it is one of a batch that were put together as presentation guns from 0 series parts. What makes this distinctive is primarily this rounded hump on top of the slide. Before the 0 series guns, in the prototype phase, there was actually what's called a slide recuperator up here, a little extra, I believe it was a spring-loaded bit to help push the slide into battery, and it was found to not be necessary. So even before the 0 series guns were made, it was removed from the design. However, they had a bunch of parts made up that still had basically the external elements for these internal parts. And so the 0 series guns have this extra cut. The controls here are pretty simple. We'll just do a quick run through of the gun using this one. We have a safety back here. Forward is fire, rear is safe. So from a right-handed grip, you can easily flip that to the fire position. There is a magazine catch on the heel. Pull that out. Useful to note that Finnish military magazines have bodies left in the white, where Swedish magazines have blued magazine bodies. Most of what you see out there are Swedish. We'll get to those in a little while. The ejection port is on the right here, and this is a short recoil gun. So when you fire, the first thing that happens is the whole barrel extension, and bolt reciprocate backward this far. That drops a locking lug. There is a vertically traveling locking lug right back in here. Once the slide is backward, then the bolt is free to reciprocate, and it will lock open on an empty magazine like this. This lever up here is the disassembly lever. These guns are really easy to take apart. So first, take out the magazine, which I've already done. pull this back just a little bit and rotate the lever down. Then the slide assembly comes off the top. We're going to pull the locking lug down, or I'm sorry, push the locking lug up, and then the bolt comes out, the locking lug itself comes out, and that is disassembled. So the way this actually works is we have this locking block here, which is going to be in the upward position when the gun is cycling, and thus allow the bolt to travel underneath it. When the gun locks, this pulls down, and that locks it into this cutout in the bolt. We have these two trapezoidal lugs on the bottom, which run in cams in the slide and frame, and that's what causes this to run up and down. And that's pretty much it. This is not that different actually than the Type 94 Nambu operating system. Now, I will point out that this can be flipped around, and it can be installed either way, but it is not a symmetrical part, although it kind of looks like it is. There's a little arrow in there that points towards the muzzle of the pistol. If you put this in backwards, you will not be able to reattach the slide. It will jam up, or it'll lock up just before you're able to push that disassembly lever back into place. So you have to check and make sure this is put in the right direction. Now, I mentioned this extra cut on the top just for reference sake. Here is a later example of the gun, the much more common version. After the 0 series, they stopped doing all the extra cuts for this protrusion. And on the inside, we have this cutout right here for the recuperator, which is no longer in the gun, along with this cutout right here in the locking block, and this cut right here in the bolt. So after the 0 series, all of those machining operations would go away. One other notable element in the L-35 design is its accelerator, which is right here. The purpose of this is when the barrel extension, when the whole thing starts to recoil upon firing, the frame is sitting here and doesn't move, and the barrel moves back against it. That kicks this L-shaped lever backwards, and the inside of that lever kicks the bolt backwards and forces the bolt to start moving at a higher velocity than the slide itself. So hence it's called an accelerator. And this actually gets into one of the weak points of the gun, namely these were designed for a relatively mild 9mm parabellum load, 123 grain at 950 feet per second, or 8 grams at 290 meters per second. And if you used hotter ammunition, which a lot of the Finnish troops tended to do, they tended to use a heavier loaded submachine gun ammunition, it would cause the frames to crack or the slides to crack in fairly short order. And apparently the cracks typically started right in this area where the accelerator was. That's kind of the weakest point in the barrel extension or slide. All of the military Lahtis, and we'll get to the commercial ones later on here, all the military ones, like, for example, German P08 Lugers, were manufactured with stock attachment lugs right here on the back. In fact, this stock design is very, very similar to the Luger stock lug, so much so that a Luger flat board stock from an artillery Luger will just about fit. The Finns had actually used artillery Lugers and Lugers in general, and so they were familiar with these board stocks. This is actually a Luger board stock, but what I want to show you here is there was a setup, a loop on the back of the Lahti L-35 holster, specifically to fit a board stock. Now, this is a Luger stock, and it just doesn't quite fit. The design is right, but the dimensions are slightly different. So the Finns had their own version of the board stock, or rather the same basically board, but a different version of the attachment lug. These were never used in significant numbers, but they thought that they might be, and so the attachment is set up in the holster. The rest of this, by the way, is just a typical flap holster. There is a magazine loading tool and screwdriver combination here, and you have a pouch for a spare magazine right there, and then of course your regular belt attachment loop right there. Now the cool looking Lahti holster is the wooden one. They made in total about 40 of these, I believe, and they were strictly experimental. They were never actually adopted. They are not numbered to the pistols, and they are occasionally marked with the SA, the Finnish Army mark, but not always. This is in structure very much like a C96 broom handle Mauser stock. The pistol fits inside, and it acts as a holster as well as a shoulder stock. So this pebbled brown leather attachment loop is present on all of the real ones, or was at one point. It is removable. There are fakes of these stocks out there, and the fakes basically never have that leather attachment loop. That's one thing to look for on those. There is a pouch for a spare magazine on these, and note that there is this little tensioning flat spring to help keep the magazine from rattling. Once you close the pouch, the magazine can't come out. Once you close the stock, the magazine can't come out unless you open the stock again. So also helps with retention there. A couple other valuable details on the stock. These were actually all made as two pieces and then just glued together along this seam lengthwise. You can see that right here. You can see the seam. You can also see it right in there. So if you find one that was made out of a single piece, that's definitely a fake holster. There's a tensioning spring here in the lid. There's a little more detail to this stock than there typically is to other shoulder holster stocks like this. The lug on the front, pretty typical. One of the things you'll find on fake ones is that they've been polished and blued really, really nicely, like a high quality Smith & Wesson sort of part. In reality, you can see machining marks on these. They were manufactured really to the exact same standard as the pistols. And we can see some fine machining marks on the pistols as well. These are not the most finely polished and finished guns ever. At any rate, the Finnish stocks do actually fit, unlike the Luger board stocks. That slides on there, and then we have a locking catch right there. There we go. That locks it in place. Clearly not the most important thing. I guess this didn't turn out to be all that practical for them because, like I said, they only made about 40 of these stocks. They were only experimental and they were never issued in any scale. Now the next batch of guns is Series 1. That consists of guns from approximately 1100 through 3700. These were the first, 2600 guns manufactured and delivered. There was a batch of about 1600 delivered, or a batch of 1100 delivered in March of 1940, and then a second batch of 1500 delivered in June of 1941, and they're essentially identical to the field trials guns, including, and distinctive for, this extra machining element up on the top of the gun. After that, we have Series 2, and at this point they had started simplifying the guns just a little bit. So Series 2 consists of guns from about 3700 to 4700. These were manufactured and delivered in 1941 and 42, and the big difference is this machining on the top. So that's a Series 0 or 1, this is a Series 2. Note that they do have loaded chamber indicators here. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but the markings on these are a VKT logo for State Rifle Factory and the designation L-39. There are serial numbers on both the frame down here and the barrel extension. And as you can see, this is one of the very first guns in the second series, or Series 2. Now with Series 3, things start to get a little more serious, and they're looking more at some simplifications to the gun to reduce cost and more importantly, get the guns produced faster. Because this whole time, at this point, the continuation war is ongoing, and there's really a serious need for military pistols, and VKT is spending an awful lot of time manufacturing not a huge number of these L-35s. So Series 3 is basically guns 4700 through 6800. About half of these were actually manufactured before the end of the war. About half of them were actually manufactured after the end of the war. And there are a couple distinctive changes that we can see in them. So you'll notice that the back of the loaded chamber indicator has been cut square instead of having this nice round profile to it. This is our Series 3, this is Series 2. Here on the side of the gun, the Series 2 and everything before it had some kind of complex machining right in here and a raised section at the front of the barrel extension. Those have both been removed. And on the Series 3 gun, it's just a flat cut all the way across down there. So this isn't, we're not talking about like last-ditch German or Japanese guns here. We're just talking about a few simple modifications to get rid of what are really unnecessary details in the design. Note that while they never did issue a shoulder stock for these in any quantity, even at Series 3, they're still putting shoulder stock lugs on the guns and taking the time to machine them. So they weren't that bad off. And just for the record here, this is, again, right at the beginning of Series 3, serial number 4966. Now, when the continuation war ended, production of new parts ended. However, VKT was able to assemble about the second half of the Series 3 guns from existing stocks of parts. And they stopped assembling guns when they ran out of completed parts. However, after the war, they would go on to take some of the remaining incompleted parts, things like, stock that had been partially machined, raw forgings, that sort of thing. And they went ahead and completed those parts and assembled them into guns to sell on the commercial market. And that is the 4th series. These are divided into both early and late 4th series guns. And there are a couple distinctive factors. The easiest one to spot from a distance is the lack of a shoulder stock lug. The commercial guns simply didn't have shoulder stock lugs. They presumably would have been the material would have been there in the frame forgings, but they just milled them off flat. Because on a commercial gun, they figured, well, there's no purpose for a shoulder stock. Series 4 guns would run from serial number about 6800 through about 9300, which would be the end of production. On the early ones, you'll notice this is 7500. They still have the loaded chamber indicator. However, it wouldn't be long before they got rid of that feature as well. Looking at serial number 8734 here, you'll see that the top of the slide is completely flat. The loaded chamber indicator is gone. In addition, where all of the previous military guns had been marked VKT, the commercial guns after 6800 are marked Valmet, which is the commercial name of what the VKT factory became. So still marked L-35, but now they're Valmet M35. One of the interesting aspects to these is they are really a remarkably heavy pistol. They're rather large for the capacity. They only have a single stack magazine, and they're, like I said, quite heavy. And this contributes to them really having this very robust feel, when in reality they're actually a somewhat fragile pistol. As I mentioned earlier, if you use relatively hot ammunition, they are absolutely known to crack barrel extensions. The Finnish military discovered this. Valmet had to make many hundreds of replacement barrel extensions for repairs. And the guns, it's weird how they are actually relatively fragile guns, but they really do feel quite reliable and robust in the hand. So it's important not to be lured in by that feeling, and make sure you shoot them with appropriate ammo if you are going to shoot them. In the United States, or really anywhere else on Earth, it is much more common to encounter a Swedish Lahti made by Husqvarna than a Finnish one made by VKT or Valmet. Husqvarna got a license to manufacture the guns in 1940, and they would proceed to make a whole lot more of them than the Finns did. 82,480 in total. Now they are mechanically the same, but there are a couple little minor design or minor manufacturing differences between the Swedish guns and the Finnish ones. First off, I'll also point out the holsters are different. This is the Swedish issue holster. Comes with 2 spare mags and a cleaning rod and a loading tool. In the US, at least right now, these are quite easy to find. A lot of them came onto the market. As for the pistols, there are a couple ways to distinguish them externally. One, of course, is just the grips. The Finnish ones have a VKT mark in the grip. The Swedish ones have an H Husqvarna logo. Next, the trigger guards are different. You'll notice that the Swedish trigger guard is larger and actually extends to the very front of the frame, where the Finnish trigger guard is shorter and does not. The front sights are different. The Finnish gun in the back here has a serrated ramp on the front sight, where the Swedish gun just has a flat front sight. There's also a noticeable difference in the barrels. The Finnish guns have this nicely finished, smooth, round barrel, where the Swedish ones are finished with a hexagonal, basically wrench flats on the barrel to make for easy assembly and easy barrel changing. Since we're far away, there's a close-up of the 2 different grip logos that you'll see. And then there's also a difference at the back. The Finnish guns just have basically the end of the recoil spring guide sits in the back of the frame. On the Swedish guns, there is this little extension out here that actually holds the recoil spring. So when you take the slide off of the Swedish example, the recoil spring is retained on the frame, where on the Finnish guns it sits in the bolt or slide until you pull it out. And of course, like I mentioned at the beginning, the Swedish magazines are blued, where the Finnish ones are in the white. If we take this Swedish gun apart, there you can see how this retains the recoil spring on the frame. That's kind of a slick system, actually. Otherwise, the internals are identical. And of course, obviously, the markings. If it's marked Husqvarna, it's probably manufactured by Husqvarna. In the Swedish military, these were given the designation M40 for their production beginning in 1940, but they are not marked M40 on the top like the Finnish ones are marked L-35. You will see some other assorted markings on these from time to time. The Swedes did sell them to Norway and to Denmark, so I think they're police-marked ones as well. That is a subject for another video, looking at some of the details of the Swedish Lahtis. Ultimately, the Finns would manufacture about 9,300 of these pistols, really a very small number all told. The Swedes would make quite a lot more, almost 10 times as many, 84,000 roughly. Valmet or VKT, they did sell them commercially, but they never got any significant military export contracts for the guns. Both Latvia and Estonia had plans to buy them, wanted to, but VKT production wasn't able to get to the point where they had enough guns to actually sell to other countries. So those guys both ended up buying FN Browning pistols instead. Anyway, I think it's pretty cool that we were able to set up here with basically every different variation of the Lahti. So hopefully I have answered all of your questions about the development of this pistol. Thank you very much for watching. If you do enjoy seeing this sort of material on the internet, you might consider checking out my Patreon account. It is support from folks there at $1 a month that makes it possible for me to find guns like this and bring them to you. Thanks for watching.